Hey guys, tonight we begin with the marbled chaos of ancient Rome to the roaring crowds, sun-scorched stone, and sheer gladiatorial pageantry of the Colosseum. This wasn't just a stadium. It was a statement. A place where emperors flexed lions, roared, and half the audience missed the good parts because someone spilled wine on their tunic. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's game day in ancient Rome, and if you're a proper Roman citizen, that means one thing. You are not sleeping in. You wake before sunrise, probably thanks to a neighbor loudly arguing about whether it's too early to start drinking watered-down wine. You roll off your stone-hard mattress, stretch your stiff limbs, and mentally prepare yourself to spend the next 12 hours packed into a stone stadium with 50,000 of your closest strangers. Why the rush? Because if you're not out the door before dawn, you'll be stuck sitting behind a column next to a guy who brought live poultry. And you'll miss the best parts of the show. Namely, everything that doesn't involve someone blocking your view with a giant feathered hat. The Colosseum may have 80 entrances, but that doesn't mean they're organized. You're funneled in with the other citizens in your seating category, which, based on your sandals and general level of grime, places you somewhere between barely respectable and technically allowed inside. Senators and patricians get marble benches and shade. You get stairs, and whatever breeze happens to sneak through the arches. Along the way, you pass food vendors shouting about honey cakes, sausage skewers, and suspiciously warm olives. You consider grabbing breakfast, but you also don't want to be holding a fig when someone elbows you in the spleen. Priorities. By the time you reach your seat, if you can call a sun-bleached slab of stone a seat, you're already sweating. It's not even 7 a.m. You pull your tunic into some approximation of a cushion, nudge a child out of the way, and sit down. Around you, the stands are slowly filling up with other blurry-eyed citizens chatting loudly about the rumors of the day. Are there really 20 tigers? Did a German gladiator bite someone's ear off? Is the emperor attending? And if so, will he be in a good mood? You don't know, but you're here. That's what matters. You made it into the Colosseum before the gates closed and the executions began. You haven't fainted, lost a sandal, or been trampled yet. By Roman standards, that's a perfect morning. As you finally get a moment to look around, the scale of the place hits you. The Colosseum is massive. We could have built schools, but instead, we did this massive, completed in 80 CE, by Emperor Titus, the man who decided bread and circuses were a legitimate political strategy. The Colosseum wasn't just an amphitheater. It was an architectural brag, a public relations stunt in stone. A way of saying, look at this empire. It's wide enough to import hippos for sport. At its peak, the Colosseum held somewhere between 50,000 to 80,000 people, depending on how loosely the fire marshal interpreted maximum capacity. It stood 150 feet high, had 4 levels of seating, and more entrances than a modern airport. It was so well designed that it could be filled in 15 minutes, or emptied in 10 if someone screamed fire or free wine. The exterior is clad in travertine limestone and decorated with grand arches, statues, and columns. The kind of aesthetic overachievement you only get from an empire that's conquered everyone else's good ideas. Inside, it's a different story. You, the humble citizen, are sitting on bare stone under an open sky, while the senators below enjoy awnings, cushions, and a breeze generated by enslaved palm wavers. Above you is the Valerium, a massive retractable awning operated by sailors, because apparently even the Navy was drafted into climate control. If it's a hot day, the Valerium might be up. If not, you'll be squinting into the sun and slowly turning into a raisin. But the real marvel isn't the marble. It's the engineering beneath your feet. Beneath the arena floor lies a labyrinth of trapdoors, elevators, cages, and pulleys. Animals, props, and sometimes very confused prisoners were launched into the arena like lethal surprises. One moment it's just sand. The next it's 30 flaming chariots and an ostrich in a helmet. It's spectacle. It's strategy. It's an absolute flex. Rome didn't build the Colosseum to be practical. They built it to remind you, as you sweat in your fourth-tier seat, that the Empire could kill you beautifully. Now that you're inside, sunburned, and emotionally prepared to sit for 8 hours, it's time to face the harshest truth of the Roman Colosseum. Your seat is a direct reflection of how little you matter. Seating wasn't general admission. It was an architectural caste system. Every tier, bench, and step was meticulously organized by social status, income, gender, and how often you dined with people who wore laurel wreaths for fun. Let's start at the bottom, or rather the best. The podium level closest to the action was reserved for Rome's most powerful citizens, senators, magistrates, and priests. They had padded benches, the shade of the Valium, and the smug satisfaction of being able to see what was happening without squinting. Some even had their names carved into the marble. Permanent seating. Imagine being so important that your chair has tenure. Just above them were the equestrians, the Roman middle upper class, or as we'd call them today, people with generational wealth and just enough modesty to pretend otherwise. Their seats weren't as plush, but they were still good enough to smell. The lions. Then came the plebeians, Rome's working class. That's you. You're somewhere up in the third or fourth tier, balancing on a sun-bleached slab of stone. Shoulder to shoulder, with a man yelling about bread prices and a woman breastfeeding, while arguing with a vendor over the price of boiled snails. If you were a woman and not a Vestal virgin, you were even higher up. Women, slaves, foreigners, and other undesirables got the nosebleeds. The views were bad, the shade was non-existent, and the smell of 50,000 Romans having feelings in wool. Tunics drifted upwards like an olfactory punishment. There were no cushions, no backrests, no cup holders. If you needed to pee, good luck finding your way back. And if someone spilled wine on you from above, that was just part of the ambience. But you came anyway. Because the Colosseum wasn't just about the games. It was about being seen, even if all anyone saw was the top of your sweaty head. Welcome to the cheap seats. No one here is important, but everyone is entertained. So, you've made it to your seat. High up, hot, and surrounded by people who believe personal hygiene is more of a seasonal suggestion than a daily habit. As you prepare for the festivities, your stomach growls. You didn't bring anything. Rookie mistake. Luckily, you're not out of options. The Colosseum had its own version of stadium vendors. Only instead of peanuts, get your peanuts. It's more like olives, slightly fermented and suspiciously warm olives. The ancient Romans loved to snack. You could buy honey cakes, sausages, dates, figs, and if you were feeling adventurous, garum-drenched nuts. Garum, for the uninitiated, was Rome's favorite fish sauce. It smelled like something you'd find in the bottom of a boat after 3 days of bad decisions. Romans loved it. You'd love it too, if your only other condiment was crushed goat liver. Vendors wandered up and down the steps, shouting their wares over the roar of the crowd. The man behind you was loudly arguing with one over the price of vinegared wine. It's watered down but still effective, particularly when you haven't eaten since yesterday and the midday sun is actively trying to kill you. Then there are the smells. Not just the food, though the blend of roasted meat and cheap perfume is doing its best to clog your sinuses. But also the crowd. The Colosseum, for all its glory, was a public bath's evil twin. No flowing water, no fresh air, just sun-baked humanity in tunics. To your left, a man fans himself with a scroll. To your right, someone brought a goat, not for food, for company. In front of you, a child is chewing something that used to be bread and now resembles stone. And somehow, above it all, floats the unmistakable scent of sweat sand and slowly wilting dignity. Still, there's an odd charm to it. The vendors are part of the theater. They know when to quiet down, when to yell, and how to dodge a vomit stain. On the stairs like seasoned professionals. You didn't come for the snacks, but now you can't imagine surviving without them, especially once the games start. You'll want something to chew on and emotionally process while watching a man try to fight a leopard with a fork. The games always started with a bang, or more accurately, a beheading. Before the gladiators took the stage, the Colosseum warmed up the crowd with a little morning bloodletting, courtesy of condemned criminals, war prisoners, and people who probably just annoyed the wrong senator. These weren't your standard boring executions either. No, this was Rome. This was entertainment. The condemned were often forced to reenact famous myths, but with the kind of realism that would make modern directors say, hey, maybe tone it down. Take the story of Prometheus, for instance. In the myth, he's chained to a rock while an eagle eats his liver every day. In the Colosseum version, a criminal is chained to a fake rock, and a real eagle is encouraged to dig in. Not symbolic violence, actual organ removal. Another crowd favorite was Orpheus in the underworld. It ended predictably, with Orpheus being torn apart by wild animals. And yes, actual leopards were involved. You're starting to realize that when Romans said live theater, they meant it very, very literally. The audience loved this part, cheering, laughing, booing, like it was a bad comedy set. The logic was simple. These people were criminals, and public execution was a civic duty and a public service all rolled into one. It was justice wrapped in spectacle, dipped in horror, and served before lunch. Sometimes the condemned were simply thrown to the beasts with no backstory or dramatic flair. Just man versus lion, minus the inspirational music. These moments were loud, fast, and if you blinked over, the crowd loved the unpredictability. The man next to you is already yelling, "Bite the leg," and it's 8:30 in the morning. It's hard to say what's more shocking, the violence, or how completely normal it feels here. This isn't considered extreme. This is just the warm-up. And as the final body is dragged off stage and the arena is readied, you find yourself clapping. Not because you're bloodthirsty, but because everyone else is clapping and you don't want to seem like the weird one. Congratulations. You're now emotionally invested, and the real show hasn't even started. After the criminals have been properly mythologized and dismembered, it's time for round 2 of the morning spectacle. The beast hunts, or venations, for those of you who like your Latin with a side of animal cruelty. Now, if you thought this part was going to be a calm interlude between gore and glory, think again. Rome didn't conquer half the world just to import silk and spices. No, they brought back everything with teeth. Lions from North Africa, elephants from India, bears from Gaul, ostriches from wherever ostriches came from before they regretted it. The arena floor transforms. Trees, fake rocks, and scenery rise dramatically from hidden trapdoors. Because, why just butcher an animal when you can give it a theme? Then out comes the hunter, a venator, not a gladiator, mind you. This guy has fewer muscles, more decorative feathers, and probably a deep sense of regret. His job is to show off, maybe fire an arrow or two, and dramatically dodge whatever angry carnivore bursts from the tunnel. Cue a lion that hasn't eaten in 2 days. The crowd is thrilled. Bets are placed. Someone behind you is already shouting, 2 sisters on the lion, and the woman next to him is trying to sell fig pastries, shaped like leopards. Capitalism lives. Sometimes it's one-on-one, hunter versus beast. Other times, it's mass chaos. A dozen panthers released at once while archers on platforms try not to shoot each other. On special occasions, elephants are brought in. You haven't truly experienced ancient Rome until you've seen an elephant stomp on a wooden replica of a barbarian village. While an official explains how this represents Rome's triumph over uncivilized lands, it's equal parts nationalistic pageant and animal-themed panic attack. And if you're wondering whether the animals ever won, yes, they did. They did. Sometimes the hunters didn't walk out, and the crowd loved that, too. There's something deeply Roman about cheering both the hunter and the thing trying to eat him. Eventually, the beasts are killed. The scenery is cleared, and someone, with a broom and a very high tolerance for trauma, comes out to clean up what's left of the morning. You take a deep breath, because up next, actual humans fighting each other for your entertainment. The crowd hushes, trumpets blare. Somewhere, a nervous goat bleats. It's finally time for what everyone's been waiting for, the gladiators. Forget the criminals and the leopards. This is the main event. The part where trained professionals try to turn each other into decorative stains on sand. If the beast hunts. We're breakfast. This is the roasted meat platter of the day, served with a side of existential crisis. Gladiators weren't just fighters. They were celebrities. Think modern athletes, but with more scars and less dental coverage. Some were slaves. Some were volunteers. Some were nobles going through a phase. All of them knew how to make an entrance. And what an entrance it is. They emerge from the darkened tunnels, like rock stars. Or maybe like livestock, who've learned choreography. Their armor gleams in the sun. Helmets sparkle. Swords are drawn. The crowd erupts. Children scream. Someone throws a garland. You're not even sure who these guys are. But you cheer anyway, because peer pressure is eternal. The announcer, yes, there is one, calls out the names, origins, and combat styles of each gladiator. A Retiarius, with a net and trident. With a smooth helmet and a short sword. A Murmillo, with a fish-shaped crest that's not helping him win any fashion contests. Each pairing is carefully chosen for drama. Big versus small, fast versus armored, local hero versus imported lunatic. This is a blood sport with casting direction. Then the fight begins. It's not just wild swinging. There's strategy, rhythm, pauses, feints, parrying, sand, lots of sand. Some fights end quickly. One bad step, one good stab. Others drag on for minutes as the fighters circle each other like angry ballet dancers with iron shoes. The crowd lives for it, gasping, cheering, shouting unsolicited advice from the upper tiers. Go for the neck, use the net, stop tripping on your own shield, Gaius. You're on the edge of your very uncomfortable stone seat. Because even from up here, you can feel the tension. This isn't some abstract performance. These men are fighting for survival, for fame, for a chance at not dying today. And the best part, it's still only midday. As you settle in for another round of organized mayhem, you begin to notice something. Not all gladiators look the same. That's because Rome didn't just want fighting. It wanted categories, themes, and stylistic bloodshed. This is less a brawl, and more a very violent fashion show. Each gladiator type had their own distinct look, fighting style, and probability of getting impaled. Let's start with the light armor, no helmet, armed with a net and trident. Basically a fisherman with anger issues. They're fast, nimble, and often pantsless, which adds an extra layer of vulnerability and breeze. Then there's the secutor, their natural enemy. Secutors wear close-fitting helmets supposedly to keep the net from catching and carry short swords. Think of them as anti-fishermen. Their job is to run at the guy with the net and hope no one brought slippery sandals. The Murmillo is the tank. Big shield, big helmet, big everything. They're slow but durable, kind of like an armored ox that took fencing lessons. Their helmets often have fish motifs, which is ironic when they're fighting a guy with a trident. Threx, Hoplomachus, Demacharis, each with their own mix of swords, spears, daggers, and reckless bravado. Some wear greaves and armed guards. Others look like they lost a bet with a blacksmith, but all of them fight with flair. This wasn't just about winning. It was about putting on a show. The audience had favorites. Not always the best fighters, but the most dramatic. The ones who posed, roared, or shouted catchy one-liners before lunging. One guy even saluted the emperor with a spin move. He died 5 minutes later, but boy did he make an entrance. The weapons were real. The blood was real. The applause also real and loud. Sometimes you'd swear the guy next to you was going to throw his sandals in the arena out of excitement. And yet there's something oddly elegant about it all. Technique mattered. Footwork mattered. If you were lucky enough to live past your first few matches, you learned how to fight smart. Or at least stylishly, because, in the Colosseum, dying was expected. Dying with bad form. Now, that was unforgivable. So, the fight is over. One gladiator's standing sweaty and breathing hard. The other's on the ground, bleeding, maybe twitching, and definitely rethinking his career choices. What happens now? Well, that depends on the mood of one man, the emperor. Yes, the most powerful figure in the known world. The guy with a literal laurel wreath on his head and his own food taster now gets to play casual death god. The surviving gladiator looks up. The crowd roars, but the final call isn't theirs. It's His Imperial Majesty, seated comfortably in the best spot in the house, under an awning, sipping wine that probably costs more than your rent. Now, you've heard the stories. Thumbs up means mercy. thumbs down means death. But like most things from ancient Rome, it's more complicated and more vague. Some historians think it was the reverse. Others think the emperor just waved his hand, vaguely, and hoped people guessed correctly. Regardless, the wounded man is looking up at the royal box with the desperation of someone who's realized that being popular was actually very, very important. If the emperor happened to be in a particularly magnanimous mood, or perhaps if the gladiator, bleeding out in the dust, had performed with enough flair to rouse some applause from the wind-drenched citizens, then he might, just might, be allowed to live. Sometimes the audience would murmur and chant something akin to mit, which, roughly translated, means let the poor fellow go. He put on a decent show and didn't scream too much. But mercy was a fickle thing in Rome. If the same gladiator had been clumsy, forgettable, or, even worse, foreign with a face that didn't make for good mosaic art, the same crowd that earlier cheered his parry might now howl for death, and the emperor, reclining in his private box, might grant that wish or dismiss it entirely with the casual flick of his thumb, depending more on his digestion than the ethics of the moment. Sometimes, he'd look to the crowd, pretending their cheers guided him, and other times he used their bloodlust as theater, to appear merciful in front of the masses, or ruthlessly unmerciful in front of political rivals. It wasn't justice. It was spectacle, choreographed cruelty, a kind of Senate-approved soap opera with a body count. If death was decreed, the victor stepped forward and dispatched the loser with the sort of professionalism only a man very used to killing could muster. Some liked to keep it clean. Quick slice, theatrical posture, nod to the audience. Others made a meal of it, dragging it out, letting the dying man soak up the last gasps of the crowd before hitting the sand face first. Either way, the ending was the same. Silence, applause, and a flute solo that somehow always managed to be upbeat. Slaves with rakes would glide in to sweep the sand smooth again, dragging away the body as if it were nothing more than a spilled amphora, and then, almost absurdly, it would begin again. Time, as always, was tight. The sun by now hovered high and hateful, making the marble benches hot enough to fry a lizard. The man to your left was slowly becoming a puddle, but you weren't leaving. You'd made it this far, and nothing short of spontaneous combustion was going to make you miss the next sword-swinging display. This was what passed for a break. The Roman version of intermission. Not a halftime show with juggling elephants or synchronized gladiators playing tambourines. Just a sudden pause in the violence. A lull filled with a subtle orchestra of groans, the scraping of shifting limbs on hot stone, and the sharp nasal cry of the peanut vendor, at least the Roman equivalent thereof, barking out deals on figs, olives, and salted mystery meat. You acquire a cup of pasca, the Roman poor man's refreshment, a drink so vinegary it could strip the rust off a shield. But it was either that or collapse from dehydration, and since licking sweat off a senator's awning was frowned upon, you drank. Meanwhile, in the arena, the slaves raked, shoveled, scraped, and occasionally retrieved the odd finger or jawbone missed during the earlier festivities. The air smelled like a mixture of zoo, enclosure, wrestling tournament, and something you'd rather not identify. But no one complained. Not seriously. They were too busy gossiping. Senators flexed their calves, aristocrats debated which fighter had the most sculpted torso, and a nearby couple casually dissected the lion match, with the wife insisting that the big cat had clearly been robbed of a fair win. Somewhere in the cheap seats, a man keeled over, faint from heat, or drama, or both. No one helped him, not out of cruelty, but because everyone else was one blink away from toppling too. If luck was with you, the great awning the Valerium was, extended overhead, its folds operated by actual sailors, because who better to rig a massive sunshade than men trained to hoist sails? It didn't provide perfect shade, but if your spot happened to fall under its reach, congratulations. If not, your body was slowly roasting like a forgotten casserole. And then, like clockwork, a trumpet blared. The man who fainted twitched, back to life. The arena stirred. The games resumed. You were parched, dazed, sunburned, and half deranged. But leaving wasn't an option. Not now. Because in the Colosseum, you didn't just watch carnage. You were part of the ecosystem that demanded it. You were the fuel. Just when you thought things had reached the peak of absurdity after lions, leopards, dismemberment, and the unexpected airborne sausaja, new madness unfurled. A naval battle, yes. Inside the same arena where 20 minutes ago, a man was mauled by a bear. This was not a hallucination, though your vinegar wine was doing strange things to your vision. On rare occasions, the Romans flooded the arena to reenact legendary sea battles. Not because it made sense, but because the engineering feat of turning a building into a temporary lake was the sort of overkill Rome lived for. They either removed the wooden floor entirely, or skipped building it altogether in earlier periods, and then sluiced water in through specially designed aqueducts, filling the space deep enough for real ships, and not tiny dinghies, either scaled-down triremes, piloted by men dressed as Greeks, or Carthaginians, or whatever mythological flavor fit the day's theme. The ships collided in watery chaos. Archers fired, sailors leaped, boats ignited for drama. Nobody really knew what was happening, least of all the men rowing. They weren't seasoned mariners. They were condemned criminals, debtors, rebels, chosen specifically for their expendability. Their mission was to fight and die in what amounted to a liquid stage play. It was less strategy, more splashy mayhem with props, and the crowd, oh, the crowd adored it. Even the jaded elites blinked in surprise when one boat burst into flames, spilling flaming bodies into the artificial sea. This was live theater, myth retold through the medium of drowning. When it ended, the water disappeared almost magically, siphoned away by unseen mechanisms and overworked men whose job descriptions were probably best left unrecorded. You sat motionless, stunned by what you'd witnessed, an entire sea war indoors, and still, somehow, this was only the prelude. The sun began its descent. The sky stretched long shadows across the arena. The breeze, if it existed, did not reach your section. The smell of sun-drenched humanity, olive oil, and existential reckoning thickened around you. By all logic, this should have been the end. Time to go home, bathe, scrub the blood off your sandals. But logic had no place in Rome's greatest show. Because now came the grand finale, last orgy of violence, designed to outdo everything that came before it. You stayed. Of course you did. No one left early. You'd just watched boats explode in a puddle. What could possibly top that? Only Rome could answer. And Rome never disappointed. You're still seated, though by now it's hard to tell if it's from exhaustion or mild paralysis. The spectacle has not ended with a polite bow or a scroll of credits. No, it winds down in the only way Rome knows how, with a final act, so ridiculous, so utterly implausible, that it makes everything before it feel strangely tame. Imagine, if you will, a formation of trained gladiators attempting to outmaneuver elephants wearing armor. Not metaphorical armor, mind you, real armor, forged by actual smiths, who probably questioned their career choices. Or a dramatic reenactment of some ancient myth where two men spend weeks rehearsing a choreographed death scene, only for one of them to forget the script and accidentally win. You wouldn't believe it if you hadn't just seen it. And now, as the last sand-soaked fighter collapses in theatrical glory, the crowd reaches its crescendo. Dying men try to die attractively, like models posing for an oil painting. Victors scream at the sky, overcome with something between triumph and mild heatstroke. The audience erupts, tunics flying, fists pumping, ethics suspended somewhere between admiration and bloodlust. Flower garlands arc through the air, landing on shoulders sticky with sweat and triumph. And in rare terror-inducing moments, a particularly brave gladiator might be gifted a small wooden sword, the rudis, a symbol of freedom. You hear people crying, actual tears. From warriors, from spectators, even from the wine vendors, who've been on their feet for hours. The emperor, naturally, does something imperial perhaps, a stern nod. Perhaps a lazy wave, or maybe he leaves early, because he's already bored. Either way, the applause roars, the dust rises. Somewhere behind you, someone vomits from too much sun and fermented barley drink, and you rise with the others, your tunic stained with a spectrum of things best not examined. Your spine bent from sitting on stone. Your mind clogged with violent images, that won't exactly pair well with dinner conversation, and yet, you'd return gladly tomorrow, if possible. Because nobody, absolutely nobody, does organized bloodshed with flair like Rome. The horns fade, the arena clears. A lone gladiator limps, off stage, perhaps on his feet, perhaps draped over the shoulders of someone more ambulatory. And then, the social tide begins its sluggish retreat. People stretch, they yawn, they judge loudly. This is peak Roman entertainment, by committee, usually shouted over the heads of slow walkers. You attempt to exit, but progress is halted by a tightly packed wall of sweaty linen and opinion. Everyone suddenly claims expertise in gladiatorial combat, despite having spent most of the day arguing over cheese. I told you the Threx was going to win? What? No. Total sabotage. That elephant was clearly unwell. Someone else insists the Secutor had an unfair helmet. Meanwhile, the vendors those tireless champions are, still hawking watered wine, and meat of questionable species. There's no food safety inspector here. Only enthusiasm and heat. Outside, the streets resemble an ancient music festival colliding with a minor landfill. Rome's sanitation strategy involves stray dogs and deeply fed-up slaves. Laurel wreaths, snapped sandals, food wrappers made from woven reeds, all of it contributing to what archaeologists thousands of years later will politely refer to as material culture. Children act out the day's best kills with sticks, screaming with disturbingly accurate sound effects. Drunken men declare that a lion looked directly into their soul. Someone begins to sing. No one knows the lyrics. No one minds. If a surviving gladiator gained crowd favor, his name spreads like wildfire. He may be invited to a senator's villa for dinner, or at the very least, a real bath. His image might be scratched onto alleyway walls. Marcus the Slayer, hot. If he didn't make it, well, there might be a funeral, if the budget allows. But you are baked in dust and remorse. Your calves feel like they've been lovingly kicked by a passing mule. You wobble, but your heart still thumps from the overload. Your ears are ringing, not from the noise, but from the memory of it. The Colosseum sleeps for now, but the stories do not. They will echo through taverns and alleyways, becoming grander, bloodier, and increasingly inaccurate with each retelling. And if you think this was a rare experience, think again. The gates creak open again next week. It's a weekly appointment with moral compromise. But now your brain, overloaded by spectacle, drifts toward a quieter question. All of this, every animal, every armored fighter, every plastered backdrop painted like Atlantis, who paid for it? Because one thing's clear. None of it came cheap. Welcome to the financial disaster known as the Roman entertainment economy. A fiscal black hole so catastrophic, it might have driven ancient accountants to drink. Start with the venue. The Colosseum under Vespasian, completed by Titus. It took over 10 years. Thousands of slaves, and more concrete than anyone should ever need. It could fit around 50,000 people, and not a single one of them paid for a ticket. Free entry. Great for morale. Disastrous for profit. The funding wore loot. Specifically the spoils of Rome's siege of Jerusalem. So every lion's cage, every fake rock painted like Mount Olympus, was indirectly sponsored by imperial theft. Think of it as the Roman version of the military-industrial complex, but with more tigers. And this wasn't a one-off. Some games lasted 100 days. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of fighters and animals were shipped in. Elephants from Carthage. Crocodiles from the Nile. There was no budget airline for hippos. They broke everything, especially the transport carts. Gladiators, too, came with costs. They needed training, armor, food, medical care, yes. Real doctors, surprisingly competent ones, trained to patch up limbs and reattach things that had been forcibly removed. If they died, someone had to pay for burial. The emperor footed the bill, occasionally joined by rich senators eager to buy political favor or delay their own death sentence. A single festival could bankrupt a nobleman, but if the crowd loved you, you were safe. At least for a while. It was a gamble. A very expensive, extremely bloody gamble. But here's the thing, Rome wasn't just putting on a show. It was enacting state policy. Bread in circuses wasn't a metaphor. It was actual governance. Feed the masses, distract them, keep them entertained, and they won't revolt when your tax system collapses or the aqueduct breaks again. Give them wine, blood, and a reason to chant your name, and they'll let you get away with just about anything. Unless, of course, you run out of money. Then even the mob turns. So you've made it through a day in the Colosseum. You've seen horror, joy, and at least one guy try to fight a bear with a spoon. You've questioned your morality. You've eaten questionable meat. You've sunburned your thighs. And as the sun dips low over the rooftops of Rome, casting golden light on discarded helmets and empty cups, the real mystery emerges not why the games existed, but why anyone ever left. Cramped stone apartments pressed together like overcooked bread rolls. Food markets where the bread was half sawdust, and the meat might still be growling. And public toilets that were less about sanitation and more about swapping gossip over the communal stink that was Rome. A city drenched in ambition, drenched in goats, drenched in other substances best not named. Where hope rose with the sun and fell into the sewer grates by night. But there was one place, one glorious, chaotic, blood-slicked place, where all of that disappeared for a few hours. Inside the Colosseum, you weren't a hunched-over cobbler, nor a half-fed slave praying not to be noticed. You were part of something grand. You were a witness, not to a battle, but to a performance so visceral it made your teeth hurt. This was how Rome told its stories, not with scrolls or schools, but with sand, steel, and screaming. Each match was a parable carved in bruises. The disciplined, structured, toga-wearing civilization of Rome, triumphing over the howling loincloths-wearing chaos of the other. Or occasionally, chaos was an actual man, and he got his head politely separated from his neck before lunch. Violence has always been humanity's weird little hobby, but Rome made it efficient, industrialized it, branded it with marble, arches, and flaming javelins. Where else could you munch on a fig tart while watching a Macedonian archer light a barbarian on fire with unsettling enthusiasm? And you couldn't skip the games, not if you valued your place in the daily gossip chain. The senators came, the beggars came, the retired centurions with hernias came. Even the nosy widow from down the street, who thought everything was ungodly, came. If you didn't go, you'd miss something ridiculous like flaming ostriches or an opera-singing gladiator, and then suddenly, no one would want to sit next to you at dinner. You'd be that guy. Wait, there were giraffes on roller skates. Where were you, Marcus? Oh, home. Tragic. And it was free. Sure. It cost you your innocence, and possibly your lunch. But your coin purse remained untouched. Rome might have taxed the air if it could, but when it came to loyalty, it knew the value of a bloody distraction. So the people came back, again and again. For the drama. For the illusion of power. For the fleeting moment where the common man could roar alongside emperors, and for once, not feel like the world was stomping on his toes. Outside, you were a number. Inside, you were an audience, and in Rome, that was the closest most would ever get to mattering. Now, imagine Europe again, only skip forward to the medieval era before guilds existed. Let's say 1100, the kind of year where horses outnumbered books and fire was still considered cutting-edge technology. The air in town reeked of wet straw, damped fur, burned onions, and someone's failed dream of plumbing. The streets twisted like drunk eels between leaning houses, and every corner had a merchant hawking something of suspicious origin. You needed shoes. The first cobbler claimed he apprenticed under a Parisian genius. The second said the stars taught him. Their shoes looked the same. Both were awful. One dissolved in puddles. The other gave you blisters that required spiritual counseling. That was life in a pre-guild world. A guessing game of whether the thing you bought would last a week or disintegrate before dinner. There was no quality control, no regulations, and no one you could complain to unless you liked yelling at the wind. Anyone with a hammer and a prayer could call themselves a craftsman. Some were talented, most were, let's say, innovative, in the worst ways. Apprentices had no protection. Maybe you'd end up with a master who knew his trade, and only threw hammers when angry. Or maybe your master was the kind who taught you nothing, made you stir soup, and hit you with a boot every time he sneezed. Wages hilarious. You earned what your boss felt like paying, which, shockingly, was usually not much, and customers had no safety net. Your bread might include sawdust. Your wine might include more sawdust. Tailors could hand you a tunic so ill-fitting, it looked like it had been designed for a goat mid-carpal spasm. Honesty was optional. Accountability was non-existent. But towns were growing. Trade was expanding. And the chaos of unregulated craftsmanship was becoming more than just an annoyance. It was threatening the economy itself. So, like all good systems, the guilds began not with trumpets and fanfare, but quietly, out of sheer desperation. In taverns thick with smoke, in churches echoing with whispered curses, or under trees that had heard too many complaints, skilled tradesmen began to gather. Smiths, weavers, bakers, carpenters, people who actually knew what they were doing, and were tired of being lumped in with the frauds. They didn't call it a guild at first. It was just a bunch of frustrated professionals protecting their collective dignity. They made rules: no cheating, no undercutting prices to starvation levels, no training fools who thought anvils were edible. Slowly, these gatherings formalized. They gave themselves names, crests, charters, codes of conduct, and they created control. If you wanted to be a mason in their town, you had to go through them. No guild approval, no customers, no customers, no bread, no bread. Good luck surviving. Guilds became part labor union, part trade school, and part medieval boy band, with secret handshakes and lots of candles. Everything had candles. Even the fishmongers. Even the taxes. Small towns got in on it. Even villages with more cows than humans had a guild of coopers or weavers, meeting behind barns to discuss stitching patterns and possibly burn someone's reputation. The guilds enforced standards. Sell fake bread. Expect public shame and a lifetime of angry whispers. For workers, it was a golden rope ladder. If you were poor but skilled, a guild could raise you. You'd start as an apprentice, mostly sweeping, occasionally learning, and if you survived the verbal abuse, you'd become a journeyman. Then came the masterpiece, a literal finished product judged by the guild elders. Pass the test, and you earned the title. Master, a real one, with responsibilities, apprentices, and slightly better bread. Towns loved it. Quality improved. Fraud declined. And best of all, guilds were taxable. Nothing warms a medieval mayor's heart like taxable citizens who voluntarily regulate each other. By the 1100s, guilds weren't just common, they were power players. They controlled prices, monitored trade, and in some places, bullied the local government with more finesse than the barons. Want to challenge them? Good luck. These weren't informal clubs. They were gatekeepers of knowledge, guardians of tradition, and let's face it, protectors of a very lucrative monopoly. Want to make shoes? You'd better light a candle, recite an oath, and hope your stitching impressed the old men in itchy robes. Because if not, you'd be back on the street, selling turnips with a sign that said, "Former shoemaker. May have skills." So then you're 13, maybe 12, if you're unlucky. And instead of playing marbles in the mud, or chasing pigs through alleyways, like a normal medieval youth, you've been sold off, politely of course, to an elderly man with a heavy apron, scarred hands, and a nose like burnt bread. He's not your uncle. He's not your teacher. He's your master now, in every possible sense of the word. You are no longer a child. You are an apprentice. Which, in this context, means you get to scrub soot out of a forge, run errands during snowstorms, stir dangerously bubbling vats of mystery liquids, and sleep beside the goats. And in return, you get absolutely nothing. No pay, no tips, not even a thank you. In fact, your own family likely paid him for the privilege of letting you survive under his roof. Because this wasn't just a job, it was part job, part unpaid internship, part orphanage, part medieval Navy SEAL training. For the next several years, you were expected to absorb every ounce of knowledge this master could squeeze out of his splintered soul. And if you were lucky, you'd survive long enough to use a tool without being smacked for holding it upside down. Then, when your body was aching, your hands were scarred, and your childhood long buried beneath calluses and burnt eyebrows, you became a journeyman. Not quite a master. Not quite a nobody. A sort of wandering middle child of the labor world. You are now allowed to travel. That's right, journey is in the name. You'd drift from town to town like a bearded medieval freelancer, taking short-term gigs with various masters, working just enough to eat, sleep, and maybe afford the occasional mutton pie, but still, no guild membership. You were tolerated, not celebrated. To level up, to reach the fabled land of mastery, you had to create something special, a masterpiece, no less. One item, one chair, one sword, one tapestry, painstakingly perfect. So impeccable it could stand before a tribunal of frowning old men and survive their collective scowls. They'd inspect every stitch, every weld, every curve and crease, with the same intensity modern art critics reserve for coffee stains. And if even a single thread rebelled against symmetry, back to journeyman you went. But, if, by some miracle or divine intervention, your masterpiece passed their scrutiny, congratulations, you are now a master. A real one, with rights, with a shop, with the ability to boss around your own apprentice and complain about how soft the younger generation had become. But don't get too excited, because being a master didn't mean freedom. It meant obligation. You were now shackled, ceremonially of course, to the guild. And the guild had rules. So many rules they needed a separate building just to store them. You couldn't open your shop on certain days. You couldn't charge less than the agreed price. You couldn't use unapproved wood, unauthorized dyes, or overly enthusiastic apprentices. Violating these codes meant punishment, not the slap-on-the-wrist kind, but the theatrical, shame-filled variety. Fines, blacklists, public humiliation. If your work was subpar, they could banish you from the entire town, not fire you. Banish you, because these guilds, dear listener, were no small clubs. They were part fraternity, part cartel, part extremely well-dressed cult. They had rituals, secret handshakes, patron saints. They had halls grander than most churches, with stained glass, tall banners, and enough incense to knock out a donkey. And they had influence. Walk into any medieval city, Bruges, Ghent, London, and you'd find the guilds not just influencing life, but practically scripting it. Streets were named after trades. Guild halls were the skyscrapers of the day, and the men inside them weren't just craftsmen. They were politicians, judges, kingmakers. Elections were settled behind oak doors, not in open forums. Mayors were chosen not by the people, but by whose cousin had the best pitchforks. Some guilds even had armed security, small personal militias who ensured no tax collector got ideas about fair rates. But for all their rulebooks and punishments, the guilds also had a soft side. If you lost a hand, fell off a roof, or accidentally drank something labeled not wine, the guild would cover your expenses. If your home caught fire, they'd rebuild it. If you died, they'd bury you with respect and care for your widow and children like their own. In a world with no hospitals, no pensions, and no sense of mercy from the taxman, the guild was your safety net, a gruff, rule-heavy, ritual-obsessed safety net, but a net nonetheless. And then came the parties. Oh yes. Every trade had a festival. Bakers had Saint Honor, blacksmiths had Saint Eligius, and everyone had an excuse to dress up, march down the street, eat too much, and drink even more. Sometimes they'd have competitive games, tug-of-war between butchers and tailors. For example, because nothing says spiritual devotion like dragging your opponent face first through mud while singing hymns. Of course, all this harmony was surface-level guilds often hated each other. Cobblers thought tanners were trespassing by making boots. Carpenters accused shipwrights of muscling into their nail quota. These turf wars turned into lawsuits, or duels, or tavern brawls featuring surprise hammers. Still, for all the blood and bickering, the guilds brought structure. Without them, cities would have devolved into chaotic barter pits. With them, towns ran like machines, slow, rigid, but reliable. But predictably, power does what power always does, it curdles. As guilds grew, they became less about merit, and more about lineage. Want to be a master? Hope your father was one. Hope your cousin was one. Hope your surname rhymed with the right patron saint. Because the masterpiece, that perfect tapestry you bled into for months, didn't matter if the elders didn't like your face, your origins, or your slightly non-traditional stitching techniques. The guilds hardened into hereditary clubs, their doors closing tighter with each passing decade. Outsiders, foreigners, the poor, those with suspiciously new ideas, were kept firmly outside. You could work as a journeyman for your whole life, delivering excellence daily, and still be told, no shop for you, your bread lacks ... soul. If you defied them, if you dared open your own workshop, or sell outside the guild's permission, you'd be greeted not with a warning, but with a visit. From the enforcers. Yes, they had those. Actual guild muscle. Men whose job was to shut you down, smash your tools, intimidate your customers, and fine you into oblivion. In worse cases, they'd have you flogged, jailed, or simply removed from town like an unwanted rat. All in the name of standards. Of course, critics called it a monopoly. Guilds called it tradition. Tomato, tomato. But make no mistake, beneath the festive banners and ritual oaths, the guilds were no fluffy brotherhood. They were machines of control. And if you weren't inside them, you were on the outside forever. You'd think the guilds were about honest trade, clean aprons, and sturdy craftsmanship. And at first, maybe they were. But as the centuries slouched on, and more coin trickled into the hands of those wearing velvet-trimmed tunics, guilds began to resemble something else, entirely little kingdoms, with their own thrones, spies, and battlefields. Political warfare played out, not with swords, but with spoiled shipments, faked inspections, and whispered rumors in ale-soaked taverns. It was a world where blacksmiths might bribe an official to stall a carpenter's permits, where brewers tattled on bakers for using too much barley, and tailors, of all people, rigged council votes to snatch up municipal contracts for ceremonial robes. They didn't just hammer or stitch or pour, they manipulated, conspired, and sometimes ruined rivals over a misplaced buttonhole. And then, beyond the hammers and hierarchy, stood the women. On parchment, some guilds technically allowed female participation, particularly in trades like weaving, brewing, or preparing meats and baked goods. But that permission often wilted in the light of reality. Women could inherit a husband's shop when he died, sure, but full guild membership, that was another matter entirely. They were tolerated at best, invisible at worst. A woman could keep a business afloat, delight customers, employ apprentices, and still find herself omitted from the guild rolls, her contributions erased with the flick of a quill. Power, as always, wore a beard. And for a woman to climb the ranks, she needed not just talent, but iron resolve, and probably a few bribes. Now, despite all this elbow-throwing and gatekeeping, guilds did excel at one thing: education. Or perhaps more accurately, indoctrination disguised as training. In an age when universities were for theologians, canon lawyers, or the occasional monk with a photographic memory, the guilds handled practical education, the kinds of lessons that involved molten iron, sticky dough, collapsing scaffolds, and maybe the occasional rat in the storeroom. You didn't just pick up a trade on a weekend. Apprenticeship was a ritual, a long disciplined grind through sweat, blisters, and a master who was equal parts teacher, landlord, and emotionally unpredictable overlord. An apprentice's daily life began before the sun and ended long after. The tools were hung up. They swept, fetched, observed, repeated. For months, maybe years, they wouldn't be trusted with anything sharper than a broom. One misplaced chisel, one singed tunic, and they were back to stirring glue or counting nails. Their master was less a mentor, and more an omnipotent force who could teach you the secrets of the forge or assign you to clean the chamber pot for a week because you sneezed near the dye vat. But if you endured and didn't accidentally die of smoke inhalation, there was a ladder waiting. Not golden, but well. From apprentice, one might rise to journeyman status, a sort of certified tradesperson with a passport of calluses. Journeymen didn't just work, they wandered. A young stonemason might trek from Nuremberg to Naples, collecting techniques, drinking, songs, and bad tattoos along the way. In places like Germany, this stage became almost ceremonial. The Wondershaft, they called it, a structured rite of passage, where tradesmen roamed with dignity and very precise dress codes. But behind the romance of all this was a clever trap. The guilds weren't just about spreading skills, they were about hoarding them. Techniques, recipes, tool designs, these were sacred scrolls, passed down in secrecy. Want to know the perfect temperature to temper steel? You'd better be a Dewsbang member. Curious about dye formulas? Get initiated, or get lost. There were no pamphlets, no books, and certainly no YouTube tutorials. Just grizzled men with soot-covered cheeks and suspicious attitudes. That tight control meant guilds could maintain their standards, or more cynically, their monopolies. The knowledge stayed within the family. The guild family. Outsiders stayed on the outside, squinting through the shutters at the flicker of lamplight. But if you made it, and if you climbed the pyramid and reached the summit, you were rewarded with more than a trade. You were part of a living, breathing institution that shaped every aspect of life. Being in a guild wasn't just about employment. It was your identity, your tribe. It told you what church pew to sit in, which festival banners to carry, even what kind of shoes to wear on St. Eligius Day. Guilds had patron saints, battle flags, annual parades, ceremonial robes, sometimes even mascots, because nothing says skilled cobblers like a goose wearing tiny boots. Bakers marched behind golden bread loaves on sticks. Butchers polished cleavers and wrapped them in ribbons. These events weren't mere festivities, they were public displays of rank, wealth, and who had recently won a petty spat with the city council. If you were a master, people noticed. Velvet capes, fur collars, embroidered gloves. You didn't just bake bread. You were the bread, the top slice. Even a humble journeyman in a respected guild held more prestige than a land peasant. And if you were a marriageable daughter, the guild's crest above your family shop practically came with a dowry of suitors. But not everything was ceremony and roasted oxen. Guilds fostered real community. Members swore oaths not just to quality or secrecy, but to each other. If a member died, the guild paid for his burial and looked after his orphans. If your tools were stolen or your leg gave out mid-harvest, they might pass the hat and get you back on your feet. These weren't co-workers. They were brothers, sisters, comrades in arms, bound not just by trade, but by ritual, memory, and the occasional drunken sing-along. The guild calendar shaped the year like a great stone wheel feast, days, patron saints' vigils, solemn masses, banquets funded by last month's beer sales. Guilds reminded their members that their work wasn't just labor, it was divinely sanctioned, approved by God, or at least by St. Crispin and a very stern abbot. In a world of war, disease, famine, and arbitrary tax hikes, the guild gave structure, purpose, and the comfort of belonging. If you wanted to know who someone really was, you didn't ask for their name, you asked their guild. But as time ticked forward, and church bells rang into the dawn of the Renaissance, a new question began to echo through the alleys and workshops. Could this centuries-old order survive what was coming next? For hundreds of years, guilds had ruled like robed emperors over cobbled streets and smoky markets. But by the late 1400s, cracks had begun to form, subtle at first, then gaping. Cities grew. Populations surged. Trade routes twisted and expanded like tangled thread. And the guilds, built for smaller times and simpler scales, found themselves overwhelmed. Their rulebooks, once so precise, now looked like brittle parchment under a thunderstorm. There were too many new people, too many foreign goods, and most dangerously of all, too many new ideas. And then, as if summoned by a mischievous economic spirit, came the merchants, the movers, the shippers, the middlemen. While the guilds focused on craft and tradition, merchants focused on movement and margin. They didn't care if the thread was spun by a prayerful widow or a water wheel, only cared about the profit per pound. And unlike the guilds, they formed their own alliances, merchant leagues, shipping conglomerates, banking clans who spoke 4 languages and paid no taxes. Slowly, they began to whisper in the ears of kings and councils. And suddenly, the masters of the old world found themselves staring at polished boots, stepping across the threshold of a new one. Efficiency had begun to overshadow tradition. The Renaissance didn't exactly do the guilds any favors either, with new ideas spreading like wildfire through pamphlets and ink-stained fingers. People began re-examining everything they once accepted as gospel monarchies, religion, social order, and yes, even the guilds. What was once seen as a noble protector of craft and quality was now being labeled by reformers and merchants as a crusty obstacle, too closed off, too paranoid, too full of secrets. The printing press only hastened their decline, pouring fuel on the fire by spreading how-to guides and technical manuals to anyone with a few coins and a curious mind. No apprentice oath required. But the biggest nail in the coffin didn't come from books. It came from business. As capitalism crept across the continent, workshops sprang up outside guild jurisdiction, run not by masters but by entrepreneurs with profit on the brain. Instead of slow ceremonial training, they preferred quick, cheap labor bodies over skills, speed over art. Apprenticeship ladders suddenly looked less like a noble path and more like a traffic jam in an age of shortcuts. And when kings and queens realized that guilds were standing in the way of direct taxation and trade control, they didn't hesitate. Charters were nullified, rules rewritten with royal stamps. In some regions, guilds weren't reformed, they were erased. The guilds scrambled. They tried mergers. Some updated their methods. Others threw themselves at the feet of monarchs, begging for special treatment. But it was a losing game. By the 1700s, in many urban centers, guilds had been reduced to costume parties, still hosting parades and giving long-winded speeches in ceremonial robes. But the economic muscle had shifted to factories and financiers. The very institutions that once stood for innovation and worker dignity had become, ironically, relics resisting change. Still, their ghosts never left the room. It simply changed outfits. You don't have to squint too hard to spot the fingerprints of medieval guilds in modern life. That vocational school downtown, that's a direct descendant of the old apprentice halls. The idea that you need to train under an experienced hand before getting certified. Guild logic, pure and simple. Even the word masterpiece still lingers with its original meaning, a crowning work, meant to prove your skill. And unions. Those fiery modern collectives fighting for fair wages and worker safety. They're the grandkids of the guilds. Before Marx ever picked up a pen, medieval guilds were organizing protests, demanding just compensation, and providing for injured members when the crown looked the other way. Today's unions may not have saints' names or feast days, but their core purpose, protecting the working class with dignity and solidarity, remarkably familiar. Guilds didn't just define labor. They shaped how we think about work itself. The notion that a trade is more than a job, that it's a profession, a calling with pride, standards, and accountability stems from guild culture. Every licensed electrician, every certified plumber, every architect with an official board, all walking, occasionally begrudgingly, in the footsteps of those medieval carpenters and stonemasons. Even the corporate world owes a silent debt. Guilds had member tiers, regulatory codes, shared halls, and a kind of proto-legal infrastructure that looks suspiciously like modern business frameworks, just with fewer spreadsheets and more candlelight. Their influence also seeps into our towns and our celebrations. Take a stroll through any old European city, and you're likely to wander down a butcher's lane or weaver's row. That's not a coincidence. Those streets were their kingdoms. Coats of arms, ancient festivals, and ceremonial dinners in places like London's Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths still carry echoes of the guild tradition. Even if today they're more about pageantry than power. But perhaps the guild's greatest legacy was existential, not economic. In a time when warlords, famine, and disease could erase you from the map overnight, being a guild member gave a person roots, an identity, belonging. You weren't just a wandering craftsman, you were a part of something, a thread in a woven tradition. Of course, none of this is to suggest they were saints. Guilds could be rigid, snobbish, even exclusionary. They monopolized trades, kept outsiders at bay, and often preferred old methods over innovation. But in a world of chaos, they provided structure rules, roles, and a system, however imperfect, that helped towns function and workers survive. They shaped lives as much as they shaped tools. So next time you see the phrase Master Carpenter on a sign, or find yourself standing on a street named after a long-forgotten trade, pause for a moment. You're walking through the echoes of an ancient system, one that, despite its flaws, the scaffolding for how we still think about labor, loyalty, and legacy. You find yourself in the heart of a medieval village, where the wind is sharp and the fields lie frozen in silence. It is the midwinter solstice, a time when the sun hangs low, barely brushing the horizon, and people huddle closer to firelight than to faith. But rather than despair, they celebrate. They light bonfires meant to scare away the shadows and roast whatever edible creatures wandered too close. Trees, yes, entire trees, were dragged inside and slowly burned as Yule logs glowing in the hearth for 12 nights straight. An embered prayer that the darkness wouldn't swallow them whole. The church, ever the opportunist, took one look at this pagan warmth and rather than extinguishing it, chose to anoint it. Yule became Christmas, or at least something that smelled similar, just with a bit more Latin, by the Middle Ages. The 12 days of Christmas stretched from December 25th to January 6th, and although saints now stood in place of spirits, the revelry remained unapologetically rowdy. In noble halls, feasting took center stage. At the top of the culinary food chain sat the boar's head, roasted, perfumed with herbs, crowned with fruit, and paraded into the hall on gleaming silver, while someone chanted in a dead language nobody fully understood. For peasants, boars were rare guests. Pigs, however, were tragically available. And so, every edible part was claimed: meat, organs, and yes, even blood. Tables groaned under trenches of stale bread piled high with roasted game, pies stuffed with a dubious mix of dried fruit and greasy meat, thick vegetable pottages that looked more like mud than food, and puddings tied up in cloth sacks and boiled until vaguely edible. Mead, ale, and mulled wine flowed in such abundance it's a miracle anyone remembered what they were celebrating. But it wasn't just gluttony, it was theater. Wandering performers known as mummers arrived to retell biblical stories, though usually with accents suspiciously local and plots suspiciously irreverent. Lords allowed jesters to mock them, clergy endured gentle blasphemy, and in some parts of Europe, junior priests dressed up and staged fake ceremonies in what became known as the Feast of Fools. It was a chaotic, laughable, blessed mess. Homes were dressed in holly, ivy, and whatever green thing hadn't died yet, symbols of stubborn life in the dead of winter. Yule wasn't just about indulgence, it was about defiance. In the bleakest, coldest weeks of the year, people lit fires, laughed at death, and tried to remember that joy was still a reasonable reaction to being alive. And then, just when the bread hardened and the wine ran low, Epiphany arrived. Celebrated on January 6th, Epiphany commemorated the arrival of the Magi to the Christ child, or, in simpler terms, the medieval season's grand finale. After nearly 2 weeks of non-stop drinking, eating, performing, joking, mocking, and pretending to be bishops, the 12th night still commanded full attendance. No one missed it. Not because of religious obligation, but because it was the final, legally sanctioned Day 2, act absurd, before misery resumed. The centerpiece of the feast was a spiced cake, known as the King's Cake. It wasn't just food, it was a lottery. Hidden inside was a token, sometimes a bean, sometimes a coin, sometimes something sharp enough to chip a tooth. Whoever found it became the Lord of Misrule for the day, crowned with paper, toasted endlessly, and expected to issue ridiculous commands that everyone pretended to obey until the ale ran dry. Imagine a room full of tired villagers and hungover nobles gnawing cautiously through their dessert, each silently hoping to win the crown without losing a molar. The church did its best to keep Epiphany solemn, trying to emphasize Christ's revelation to the Gentiles, but the people heard revelation and interpreted it as role reversal. Servants mocked masters, children were made bishops, and women took charge while men fetched wine. In England and France, small boys led mock sermons, dressed in oversized mitres, surrounded by adults, pretending to take them seriously. It was a glorious, chaotic, and strangely holy mess. And of course, more food arrived. Roasted meat, candied almonds, thick custards, and enough spiced wine to make the room spin clockwise. Wealthier homes flaunted their access to imported flavors like saffron, cloves, and cinnamon, culinary badges of global awareness, or at least, a merchant uncle. Epiphany was an odd blend, part spiritual contemplation, part theatrical rebellion. It reminded everyone that for all the rigid rules and hierarchies of life, there were still days when peasants became kings, boys became bishops, and everyone, for one glittering evening, got to pretend the world was a little kinder. But like all feasts, it ended. And what followed was Lent, the long, cold walk back to reality. If medieval feasting was a bonfire, Lent was the ice water. It lasted 40 days, not including Sundays, and made up in restraint what it lacked in joy. The party ended on Shrovetide, a final burst of indulgence where families cleared their pantries in a reckless spree of butter, eggs, and meat. Pancakes, pastries, sausages, all had to go before the curtain fell, and fall it did. Ash Wednesday marked the start of the long abstinence. Meat was banned outright. Depending on the region, so were eggs, dairy, and even cooking fats. Imagine porridge without milk, bread without cheese, vegetables boiled without lard. The diet became monotonous, gray, and often fishy. Monasteries had detailed manuals to guide fasting. Lay people mostly copied, except when they didn't. Creative theology blossomed. In medieval France, the beaver's tail was declared fish and eaten guilt-free. In parts of Europe, barnacle geese, birds believed to grow from driftwood in the sea, were likewise consumed, under the logic that they were only sort of birds. Science may have protested, but hungry bellies prayed otherwise. Still, for the poor Lent was grim. They had little to give up to begin with. There were no salted hams or sweet custards to renounce. Hunger deepened, children went pale, and the world felt slower, grayer, and less musical. But all of this suffering served a purpose. It carved out space for Easter, not just theologically, but emotionally. By Holy Saturday, kitchens that had lain dormant sprang back to life. Ovens roared. Butter was churned. Eggs hoarded, or newly laid, were transformed into custards. Lambs were roasted, sweetbreads spiced, wine uncorked. Lent was the winter, Easter the thaw. And no matter how grim the fast, the feast that followed always tasted like resurrection. At long last, the gray days were behind you. 40 days of pious restraint, of thin soups, hollow bellies, and dull skies had led to this moment, the grand unlocking of appetite. The sanctioned burst of color, flavor, music, and rebirth. This wasn't just a return to eating. No, this was Easter. And in medieval terms, Easter was not merely a holy date, was a full-body resurrection. After weeks of chewing moral fiber and spiritual repentance, the people did not merely eat them, feasted like exiles, returning from a bland and penitential wilderness. The Easter vigil had been long and full of solemn hymns, candlelit patience, and that breathless silence that hovered over towns waiting for permission to live again. And then, suddenly, bells rang out. Christ is risen. Light returned to the church, to the streets, to the collective ribcage of the people. And like a cork popped from a barrel of good wine, the town exhaled. The fast was over. The feast had come. And oh, what a feast! Roast lamb took center stage. Symbolic of divine sacrifice, but also deeply practical for anyone who'd spent 6 weeks pretending salted fish was a satisfying meal. In richer homes, there might be a roasted piglet, all smug and shiny, with an apple in its mouth, as if even it was celebrating. Ham reappeared on platters like an old friend, with good stories. But even the poor had their moments. Cheeses returned, buttered breads emerged from ovens, and eggs were everywhere. You boiled them, dyed them, hid them inside pastries, cooked them into custards. They weren't just symbols of rebirth, they were backlog. Because let's face it, chickens don't care about Lent, they lay regardless. So by the time Easter rolled around, there were eggs in such abundance, it bordered on comic. Honey cakes were dusted with fruits. Braided breads were laced with spring herbs. Spiced wines were poured with heavy hands. Vegetables returned too, now roasted in the glistening sin of animal fat, reminding everyone just how good transgression could taste. In towns where Jewish and Christian traditions lived side by side, you'd sometimes find Passover's influence sneaking in bitter herbs. Flatbreads, stories told aloud between bites. Children laughed in the streets, rolling eggs in games that made little sense but sounded joyful enough. Musicians wandered with their lutes and pipes, and nobles, draped in velvet piety, handed out sweet buns and coins to the poor, like benevolent kings in borrowed holiness. Monks choreographed elaborate reenactments of the resurrection, complete with incense, bells, and enough smoke to make a bishop disappear. It wasn't just religion, it was theater. It was euphoria with scripture. And in a time when famine was familiar, when plague could knock at any door, joy wasn't just nice, it was necessary. And so it might surprise you to learn, in your soft bed centuries later, that the very institution we imagine as the buzzkill of celebration, the medieval church, was often the life of the party. The priests, monks, bishops, they weren't just spiritual referees wagging fingers. They were the caterers, the hosts, the party planners with divine approval. The church calendar didn't merely outline what not to eat. It also told you when to feast. Saints' days, martyrdoms, holy anniversaries, each one came with its own menu. In fact, monasteries weren't just quiet places of prayer. They were logistical engines of agriculture and hospitality. They had fields, breweries, fish ponds, cheese caves, and pantries the size of small kingdoms. On special feast days, their kitchens roared with activity. Fish baked in wine, fresh loaves cooled on long wooden racks. Jars of preserved fruit were popped open like treasure chests. And if the day was truly sacred, there might even be sugar. Real sugar. The white gold of medieval cuisine, reserved for saints, kings, and very lucky guests. Bishops and abbots were expected to host grand banquets, where the presence of food was a statement of both holiness and power. The poor might be invited too, not merely as charity, but as living symbols of the feast's sacred abundance. It was generosity baked into the crust of pies. Even the humble parish priests played their part. They'd bless the bread and the wine, then sit down to enjoy it, probably with a few stories and a second helping. Sometimes the churchyard itself transformed benches, music, dancing, and tables creaking under the weight of communal indulgence. The sermon ended in the morning. The cider flowed by dusk. Of course, critics emerged like curdled milk in the midst of all this festivity. Reformers complained about plump monks and decadent abbots sipping imported wine. They grumbled about velvet cushions and golden chalices filled with gravy instead of grace. But the church defended its feasts fiercely. This was joy made edible, theology you could chew. Bread was more than sustenance, it was body. Wine was more than drink, it was celebration incarnate, and joy. Joy was not indulgence. Joy was a fruit of the Spirit. Feasting was not a break from holiness. It was one of its loudest hymns. And nowhere was this louder than in the great halls of holiday banquets. You see, these meals weren't just about stuffing your face. They were performances. A medieval feast was a sensory opera. Music, laughter, smells that curled around the rafters, jesters juggled. Dancers stomped. Minstrels plucked out tunes about saints and seduction, often in the same verse. And after enough ale, even the noblest knight might be heard belting out a bawdy rhyme or two. Then came the mummers, masked players telling absurd stories in strange costumes, half play, half fever dream. They wore antlers or wings, mocked local officials, and recited biblical tales with comic accents that would probably get them excommunicated if the bishop wasn't too busy laughing. The Feast of Fools took things even further. Priests dressed as peasants, peasants pretending to be bishops, sermons delivered backwards or in rhyming verse. It was chaos with a halo. But the food performed too. This was culinary theater. Pies that released live birds when cut. Sugar sculptures of mythical beasts. Swans redressed in their own feathers, roasted golden and majestic like edible mascots of glory. Some dishes were practical jokes. Others were edible architecture. Castles made of pastry. Ships made of bread. Dragons made of marzipan. It wasn't just dinner. It was spectacle. It was joy with gravy. It was a reminder that even in a world shadowed by death, there could be moments when life roared back with bells, with laughter, and with meat. And so you drift off now, full from the imagined banquet, the echo of medieval bells faint in your ears, because in that distant world of fasting and feasting, of piety and pageantry, joy was not just allowed, it was sacred, and the taste of it, however brief, was eternal. You find yourself reclining at a long table beneath fluttering tapestries, the air thick with roasting meat and the clang of silver on wood. Rich lords have spared no expense between courses, acrobats tumble, trained bears rear, jesters contort themselves into living jokes, and dwarfs perform feats of strength so improbable you almost wonder if they're enchanted. There is no subtlety. Here, this is spectacle in its purest form, a feast that doubles as theater, and every guest, from the lowliest squire to the highest noble, has a front row seat. The meal itself tells a story. You nibble on fish, shaped into crosses, a silent sermon on your tongue. You break bread stamped with hidden icons, each loaf a coded message of piety and power. Sauces arrive in colors that mirror the church calendar vermilion, for martyrs, gold for saints, deep green for hope, reminding you that nothing on these plates is accidental. To dine at a medieval holiday banquet is to step inside a living parable, where the savory aroma of spiced game mingles with the crackle of torches. And you laugh, you gasp at the fire-breather's plume, you marvel at sugar sculptures of dragons, or miniature castles sculpted from marzipan that seem poised to breathe themselves to life. In an age without theater curtains or streaming screens, this is your blockbuster premiere, complete with pudding. Yet not all feasts are created equal. While the feast day is the same for peasant and priest, what lands on your plate depends entirely on your place in the hierarchy. At dawn, in a modest cottage, the peasant family scrapes together a holiday treat from their meager stores. A chicken killed just this morning, butter hoarded for weeks, and now slathered on fresh bread. A simple apple pie tinkling with north-grown spices smuggled in by traveling merchants. Ale flowing a little more freely than usual. If their local lord is feeling generous or wary of unrest, he may stage a public feast in the village square, dragging out spits heavy with roasting meat, ladling soup into bowls, distributing sweet buns in a show of piety and political optics. In the bustling market towns, merchants and artisans take it up a notch. Their communal guild halls overflow with imported dried fruits, honey sweet cakes, fragrant sausages, and hefty meat pies. Tables grown under cheese wheels aged in cellars. Beneath cobbled streets, these feasts are public displays of civic pride, statements of economic clout, and brotherhood, proof that their trade guilds can not only craft fine wares, but also throw a party to end all parties. Yet nothing rivals the noble's extravaganza, where every course arrives like an act in a carefully directed play. Imagine roasted peacock feathers, rehung to their full fan standing proud atop a silver platter. Golden fish that glint as if dipped in molten sunlight. Towers of marzipan so intricately carved they resemble cathedral spires. Each dish debuts to a flourish of trumpets and a line of footmen bearing flaming torches. Ingredients sourced from every corner of the known world. Cinnamon from Ceylon, sugar from Venice, oranges from Andalusia. White bread replaces the coarse loaves of the commons. Fine wines formerly forbidden during Lent are poured with ceremonious grace. Special permissions and medical decrees alone allow these meats to appear on gilded plates, marking the distinction between the table of privilege and the table of necessity. Yet beyond the food lies the feast's true purpose. It binds the community together, marking the year's passage and asserting identity in a world shadowed by hunger, plague, and war. Long after the last boar's head has been carried away, after mummers remove their masks and church bells fall silent, the memory of these celebrations lingers in villagers' recipes, in the rituals passed down through generations, in the names of streets like Butcher's Lane and Baker's Row. These feasts were never mere indulgence. They were anchors in time, reminding every man, woman, and child that after darkness comes warmth, that after fasting comes feasting, that even in the harshest age, joy and communal solidarity could be as essential as bread itself. And so, centuries later, when you crack open a hot cross bun or hide a bean in a king cake, you're tracing the echoes of those medieval tables. tasting the afterglow of candlelit halls where laughter, pageantry, and the sacred act of breaking bread together were one and the same. You are 15, and Rome has decided your future without asking if you liked your cousin. But that's politics. And you, born with temples already humming your family name, have no time for likes or dislikes. Your name is Faustina the Younger. Fina, if they're feeling affectionate, and the blood of emperors runs through your veins like it has somewhere to be. You are Hadrian's great-niece, Antonius Pius's daughter, and soon, the empress beside Marcus Aurelius, Rome's favorite, melancholic philosopher. Coins will bear your face before your favorite dress does. Temples will display your mother's bust before you've even figured out how to keep your own head held high in public. You are not raised to be a person. You are sculpted to be a symbol. And in Rome, symbols don't get privacy. They get rumors. Even your silence will be interpreted. Every nod, every child you bear, every dinner you skip, will be evidence of something. They'll say you're elegant, and scandalous, and poised, and power-hungry, and maybe all of it is true. But at 15, none of that matters yet. You're married off, politely, to a serious young man named Marcus, who prefers scrolls to banquets, and who has already accepted that emperorship is less a destiny than a burden. He is the kind of man who considers emotions a philosophical puzzle, but, surprisingly strangely you to click, not like fire, more like wet clay molding together in the rain. It wasn't just a ceremonial match after all. Marcus will trust you, write about you, even love you, in his stoic, melancholic way. And in return, you will not merely stand by his side. You will hold up the entire other half of the empire's image. Your face will shine from coinage, your name whispered in both admiration and intrigue. You'll be Augusta not just in title, but in the impossible daily act of appearing serene while Rome rots from its borders inward. The empire is fraying. Civil unrest simmers, plagues arrive like clockwork, and you keep giving birth 14 times to be precise. Not because you dreamed of a noisy villa full of sticky toddlers, but because this is your job. The womb of the empire must stay busy. Of the 14, most die young. Their names are recorded in marble and forgotten in meat markets. But one survives Lucius Aurelius Commodus. Yes, that Commodus, the gladiator-obsessed wine-soaked disaster in waiting. But that's later. For now, he's a chubby-cheeked hope with a lineage heavier than his baby teeth. You do your best. You oversee his upbringing like a general inspects a new legion, making sure the philosophers and nurses don't drop him on his head. You travel with Marcus, not because you love tents and mud, but because Rome needs to see you, their boots in the dirt, regally ignoring your discomfort. The soldiers adore you. They call you Mater Castorum, mother of the camp. It's not just a nickname. You've earned it, trudging across provinces with your children, like some divine caravan of stability. They don't see you as some perfumed statue. You are present, in moments of triumph, and in mornings where your tent leaks. That matters. Roman soldiers are famously unimpressed. They don't clap unless they mean it. And they mean it for you. Yet all this power-soft, maternal public breeds suspicion. People whisper. They always do. Is she loyal? Too clever? Secretly running the empire through pillow talk. The whispers never stop. You smile. You host. You keep moving. In a world where empresses are usually symbolic, you're dangerously real. You do not flinch from power. You wear it like silk, and sometimes with just as many wrinkles. Your marriage, oddly enough, remains solid. Marcus will call you faithful in his meditations, that somber book of inner thoughts he never intended for anyone to read. For a man who believed desire was weakness, he shows surprising affection when he writes about you. You are not just his political match. You are his chosen partner in an empire that feels like it's one bad harvest away from falling apart. And yet, even that affection can't shield you from the weight. 14 pregnancies, multiple funerals, foreign campaigns, a son growing into a theatrical nightmare. And the rumors, always the rumors. They say you've had affairs. They say you drink too much. They say you're manipulating the Senate. They say you're the true power behind the throne. And you know what? Maybe they're not entirely wrong. But does it matter? You are doing what Rome needs you to. dew-bearing airs. Soothing armies, standing still while statues are carved in your image. You are both mother and monument. And you are still breathing, which is more than can be said for most people who dare to be powerful and female in Rome. Your husband, thoughtful, worn, distant, adores you quietly. The empire adores you loudly, or at least needs to. You are not a fairy tale. You are not a villain. You are the empress. And your story is only halfway through. So their union, forged under the weighty shadow of empire, was more than the polished illusion painted on palace walls. It was, in its own way, a strange collaboration between power and companionship, strategy and affection, a delicate braid of loyalty in a city that devoured its own champions with whispers sharper than blades. Fina, the younger, wasn't merely the woman behind the man. She was the woman beside him, riding alongside Marcus Aurelius as he dragged the Roman war machine across Europe's rugged frontiers, past snow-choked outposts and through pestilential river valleys where Roman authority sputtered like a dying torch. She didn't vanish into the marble quiet of the palace. Instead, she marched with the legions, her silks muddied, her sleep traded for sleepless strategy tents and makeshift altars where sacrifices were made, not just to gods, but to survival itself. Marcus, never one to lavish affection publicly, still broke Roman precedent for her. He minted coins with her image, carved her likeness into statues that bore both reverence and controversy, and crowned her with titles no empress had worn before. She was Martyr Castrorum, mother of the camp, not just a ceremonial flourish, but a formal acknowledgement of her visceral presence with the troops. The soldiers, filthy, frostbitten, and bleeding for Rome, saw in her not a goddess trapped in marble, but a woman who stood beside their emperor when the rain poured and the tents collapsed. Yet Rome, in its eternal hunger for drama, found this unbearable. To the Senate and the high-born patricians, Fina was more complicated, an unsettling mixture of loyalty and liberty, grace and gossip. Rumors followed her like sandalwood smoke through the colonnades. Some swore she whispered policy into Marcus's ear during quiet nights in the field. Others, more salacious, claimed she found comfort in the arms of gladiators, those sand-slicked demigods of the Colosseum whose fame was forged in blood. The wildest, and perhaps the most enduring accusation, was that her son Commodus, that erratic storm of a future emperor, was not Marcus's child at all, but the bastard of a gladiator. Of course, there was no proof. Rome rarely needed it. The Synod clung to the tale because it fit the tragedy they wanted, that the madness of Commodus wasn't merely imperial decay, but the poisoned fruit of feminine indiscretion. Fina, long dead, by the time her son's cruelty truly blossomed, became the perfect scapegoat. She wasn't there to refute the story, and her legacy had always been wrapped in both admiration and unease. Even her virtues became suspect in Rome's cruel imagination. Her charity establishing orphanages, feeding the poor was reinterpreted as strategic self-cleansing. Was she truly benevolent, or was she laundering her name through public goodwill? Senators scoffed from marble benches as they imagined her in the mud of the Danube, supping beside centurions, issuing quiet commands behind campaign tents. What kind of woman, they asked with disgust, disguised as decorum, dares trespass into the realm of swords and maps? But Marcus remained unmoved. For 30 years, through plagues, revolts, and the slow hemorrhaging of Rome's golden age, he stood beside her, praised her, and honored her memory, even after the gods had taken her. Whether blind, defiant, or simply faithful, his loyalty became a final refutation of Rome's poisoned whispers. And yet, Fina's life remained one long tightrope walk over the abyss of Roman judgment. She had stepped far beyond what Roman matrons were allowed to be. She blurred the lines, not just between femininity and command, but between loyalty and legacy. And this transgression, the very act of being more than ornamental, was what made her dangerous. Her battlefield title wasn't an accident of affection, it was a statement. No empress before her had dared to dwell among soldiers, to dirty her robes in the churned mud of empire's frontier. During the Marcomannic Wars, when Rome bled heavily along the Danube, Fina wasn't merely present, she was central. Her presence was morale. Her footsteps across camp mud were as noted as her husband's movements. And for the rank and file who knew nothing of senatorial sneers. She became a living emblem of Rome itself, elegant, enduring, and absurdly human. But even the strongest threads unravel under imperial strain. In 175 CE, while Rome's eastern provinces trembled under yet another wave of chaos, rebellion surged like a crack through marble. A Roman general named Avidius Cassius, believing Marcus had died, declared himself emperor. It was a mistake. Marcus lived. The coup collapsed quickly, but for Fina, already tired, already aging in the hard lines of campaign tents and soldiers' prayers, the rebellion marked a fatal turning point. She died not in a palace, but in the rugged terrain of Cappadocia, in a town called from Rome, far from rest. She was only around 45. No final audience with the Senate, no deathbed crowned in gold and incense, just the quiet end of a woman who had given 3 decades of her life to holding together a man, an empire, and 1,000 broken expectations. What survived her was memory half myth, half mirror. Statues of her wept in marble. Her name was burned into coins. Her story divided historians. Was she the Roman Helen, whose beauty changed the tide of empire? Or merely a strong woman, vilified by the insecure men she outshone? Rome never truly answered. It just kept whispering. So now, as the winds of empire change direction for the final time in our story, you find yourself standing at the edge of history's most tender contradiction: a woman who was worshipped like a goddess, slandered like a traitor, and remembered like a rumor that refused to die. You are no longer in the heart of Rome, but somewhere softer, where the marble weeps quietly under centuries of footsteps, and the names carved into stone blur under moss and moonlight. The empress is gone, Fina, the younger, no longer walking among courtiers or beside Marcus on dusty campaign roads, but her absence struck like thunder in the imperial sky. There was no pretense of restraint when Marcus lost her. His sorrow wasn't dressed in stoicism. It roared, immediate and unfiltered, shaking the polished dignity off the throne. Rome, as ever, took the private and turned it public. Grief became policy. The Senate, eager to serve or simply afraid to refuse, agreed to deify her. Just like that, Fina was promoted from Augusta to deity. She wasn't merely mourned. She was enshrined, elevated, given divine epithets, and immortalized on coins that shimmered with stars instead of laurels. Even the place of her death, the town of Halela, was rebaptized, renamed Phinonopolis, a place forever bearing her shadow. Temples bloomed like stone flowers in her honor. Sculptors chiseled her features into soft-faced eternity. Her temples rose beside her husband's, anchoring her memory directly into the sacred geography of Rome. It was reverence with a motive. Her deification, though drenched in incense and prayer, wasn't just about devotion, it was strategy. By making her a goddess, Marcus made their son Commodus, the child of a divine mother. That's how Rome worked. You didn't need to be virtuous to be venerated, you just needed good symbolism and a convenient narrative. And Fina offered both. A mother ascended to the heavens, legitimizing a mortal son who was already showing signs of not being quite Marcus Aurelius. Of course, not everyone bought the divine revision. Even as her temples were filled with garlands, the whispers didn't stop. Slander, it seems, has better endurance than marble. Some claimed she had sided with Marcus' rival. Others muttered darker things about ambition, about betrayal, about the seductions of power. It didn't matter that none of it was proven. Truth in Rome was whatever outlasted the silence. But the altars stayed. And in those temples, people prayed to a goddess whose image bore a perfect calm, not because they understood her, but because they needed to believe in something. The irony, perhaps, was that while statues of her eyes gazed upward into the heavens, her legacy remained trapped, below, drenched in human complexity. When Marcus died in 180 CE, power passed to Commodus, her son, a transition that should have marked a triumph, a golden milestone of dynastic continuity. For the first time in nearly a century, Rome had an emperor who had been born to the purple, rather than adopted into it. But the dice of destiny were not kind. Commodus was no philosopher king, no gentle thinker wrapped in meditations. He was erratic, theatrical. He fancied himself Hercules, strutted into gladiator games, and renamed Rome after himself, like a teenager redecorating his room. Administration became an afterthought. His advisors were more loyal to flattery than the state, and soon, the question no one wanted to ask started circulating like sour wine: was his mother to blame? After all, history, especially Roman history, loved a moral scapegoat. Ancient chroniclers, with their ink sharpened for judgment, traced the emperor's madness backward and found Fina's silhouette conveniently waiting. They unearthed every rumor, magnified every doubt, and sketched her as the root of Commodus' corruption. If the empire now burned under her son's rule, they reasoned, then surely it was she who struck the first match. But this isn't evidence. It's myth-making. The truth is quieter. Fina died when Commodus was still a boy. A teenager navigating swords, tutors, and the weight of future laurels. Until then, she had been the one guiding him. She had arranged his education, traveled with him during campaigns, selected tutors, whispering into his growing ear the sounds of duty and discipline. But no, mother, not even a deified one, can anchor a son forever, especially when she dies young. Some modern scholars argue that her absence, more than her presence, shaped Commodus. That without her, he drifted into the orbit of opportunists. That Marcus, consumed with empire and sorrow, missed the warning signs. And so, Fina's legacy became a fragile tapestry. Glorious, complicated. Her statues remained intact, her temples undisturbed, but her story grew barbed. She became a warning, a curiosity, a footnote beneath the shadow of her son's misrule. And yet, even in that uncertainty, she refused to vanish. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, her presence still lingers. On worn coinage, in brittle manuscripts, in quiet corners of museums where nameless tourists stare into her sculpted eyes and wonder who she was: a mother, a manipulator, a martyr, perhaps all, perhaps none. She had advised emperors, walked beside legions, watched sons die, and helped crown another. She had stood on muddy campaign roads, muddying her silks with the dust of soldiers' boots, earning the name Mater Castrorum, mother of the camp. Yet Rome, with its love of rumor and spectacle, never let her rest in peace. Writers like Cassius Dio twisted her story, making her the empress of innuendo. History hung 1,000 cloaks on her shoulders, some noble, some scandalous. Her public image remained serenely composed, but the real woman, whoever she was, had long since vanished beneath layers of bronze and speculation. Her deification was not just ritual. It was a political scaffolding. Rome needed her more in death than it ever had in life. Commodus was unstable, the future uncertain. So the empire built her into a symbol, a goddess mother, whose memory could soften the edge of a dangerous air. Her coins bore stars, not so much to honor her virtue, but to pacify the people. In death, she became the myth Rome required. And yet, scholars still argue over her soul. Was she duty-bound, or a silent schemer cloaked in maternal grace? Was she noble, or just adept at survival? The truth likely lies in the space between. That strange Roman space where power, gender, and history collided in a fog of incense and scandal. She lived behind masks, because that was the price of influence. In a world built by men and ruled by ambition, a woman could only survive by wearing roles like armor goddess, lover, mother, general's wife. But beneath all that, there was a person, someone real, someone with fears and loyalties, hopes and heartbreak. And now, as the stars above the Forum fade into the soft light of dawn, her story slips back into the silence from which it came. You've walked with her, seen the altars, heard the whispers, and now you know Fina the Younger didn't just live in Rome. She became part of its soul, not because she was perfect, but because, in being remembered at all, she outlasted everything that tried to erase her.